From the archives of the great library of Arathes, Golden City of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 47. "Forget the monster! We have to stop Dandrican!" Fraenk shouted, pulling Kyla back just as a length of shattered shipmast hit the pier beside them with a booming crash. She shot him a look like he was crazy. The Netherdemon ploughed its way through another section of docks and was on a direct path to where they were all standing. They had to escape, call for the army of the city, or the kingdom itself. They might even have to beg their neighbouring kingdom of Tigrayan for help in some kind of ironic reversal. "Come on! He's going to use it!" Fraenk shouted. Kyla looked over and saw Dandrican raising his arms, a crystalline mist beginning to form around him. Then she understood what Fraenk meant. The fool was attempting to use the mind thief on this monster.
"That's insane,"
she gasped. Then she felt a terrible premonition that was no premonition at all. Her dreams, they had warned her this was coming. They had shown her a creature just like this one destroying Arathes, thousands of souls screaming and dying in fire. Kyla understood, and it was like a door to a dungeon opening wide. The feeling made her blood run cold. "Hurry!" Fraenk had already started running, not back up the dock and into the city where he might be able to escape, but down toward the end of the pier, and the spot that was most likely slated for demolition by monster in the next few minutes. It was quite possibly the last place anyone would want to be, but they had no choice, and she knew it. Fraenk moved quickly toward where Dandrican was standing in front of the arcane structure, with Brimblade defensively behind him. Kyla was running beside him a moment later.
"You get the mind thief from Dandrican. It's on his neck. I've got a little surprise for that horned skark."
He nodded and looked relieved to not have to face the hell-touched warlock, but at the same time worried about how he would handle Dandrican now that his adversary had the necklace. He did not want to end up in another Gingerglade situation. Both of their foes were understandably distracted by the enormous creature incoming, and Kyla angled her approach away from Fraenk so she could come at him from as close to his periphery as possible. Hopefully, she could get there before he noticed her. Another mighty crash sent a shuddering vibration through the ground underneath them. They could feel a spray of water and had to dodge falling debris from the destructive rampage. Fraenk was 20 strides from the end of the dock when Brimblade must have sensed their approach, for he turned his head and looked right at him. A purple glow of energy flared around his hands. Neither she nor Fraenk could get to the hell touched in time to interrupt whatever spell he was about to unleash. But then something unexpected happened. The sacrificial man who was bound up in the arcane structure jerked to life, startling everyone. "Fane's embrace!" The bloody man cursed aloud, thrashing in his bindings. It was a momentary distraction, but it was all he needed. Kyla saw Frank's hand shoot forward with a quick flash of steel. Brimblade raised an arm and the shield spell managed to deflect the throwing knives from hitting him in the chest. Instead, it ricocheted sideways and lodged in Brimblade's shoulder muscle. He staggered backward, throwing the other spell wildly from his injured side. A wicked, crackling ball hit the centre of the docks and exploded, the spell missing a direct hit on Fraenk, but its shockwave sent him tumbling. Brimblade wasn't even looking when Kyla leaped through the air, her legs tucked and dagger raised. She hit him full force with her knees, knocking him backwards. Her arm was a spiked blur as she stabbed over and over again.
"How do you like it?"
She screamed, landing on top of Brimblade as he thrashed and tried to defend himself. Kyla didn't know how much time she'd have before he would counter, but she hoped to do as much damage as possible. She heard Brimblade utter a quick, arcanic phrase, and a flare of power launched Kyla backwards off him. Mid-air, her trained instincts immediately took over, and she twisted cat-like, using her momentum to turn her body and land in a crouch. But she watched helplessly as her dagger bounced once and splashed into the water.
"Skarking hells,"
she muttered. Brimblade was trying to pick himself up, but found all of his new punctures made it difficult. Dagger or no, Kyla was ready to stop this cursed man once and for all. With a roar, she flung herself forward, arms pumping, and slammed into him, just as he was starting to conjure a spell. They tumbled together across the boards like iniquitous lovers. She hooked her strong legs around his midsection and braced one arm under his throat, pressing down until the green gem dug painfully into her forearm. Brimblade's horns stuck into the wood, keeping his head in place. Kyla could hear him struggle for breath, his hands beating at her ineffectually. Some commotion was happening behind her as Fraenk tussled with Dandrican. Then the deafening blast of the behemoth's call, so close it could have been on top of them. Whatever was happening, she could only hope that Neversleep was handling it, and she would not let Brimblade stop him.
Please.
Brimblade managed to gasp.
I'm out of mercy.
She grit her teeth and sneered, pressing down harder. He made an awful choking sound. There was fear in his eyes. A searing hot pain flared at her forearm where the green gem was pressing. Kyla pulled back and Brimblade thrashed, releasing a wheezing shriek with his gasping breath. She could see the collar glowing hot and smelled the man's flesh sizzle.
Get it off me,
Brimblade croaked.
Help me.
Kyla stole a sideways glance and saw the green signet ring on Dandrican's fist glowing. Agony on the hell-touched's face as the emerald collar flared with it.
You can't defeat Boltsorn alone.
Brimblade grimaced, his rough brow slick with sweat. Finally, the green gem in his collar went dark, and he gasped.
He uses the collar if I don't obey him. I was forced to do his bidding. I never wanted to be a party to this. Please, let me help you.
No. I think I'll kill you and we'll take our chances.
Kyla spat.
I'm the only one who can send the demon back to the nether realm. Please.
Kyla found herself suddenly torn between the urge to choke off his airway again and some other part of her. The deeply Lin-blood part, no doubt, that felt things like pity, hope, and mercy. This foul creature had caused nothing but misery for her and Fraenk, and here he was at the end, begging for his life. But she read fear in his fiery eyes, and something that felt like truth. Maybe he was their only chance to get rid of this arcane behemoth, and maybe he was just trying to trick her into letting her guard down. Kyla saw Frank's dagger, still lodged in his shoulder. With an animalistic cry, she grabbed it out and raised it to Brimblade's neck. Fraenk was 20 strides away from where Dandrican and his hell-touched guard were standing, but he was closing fast. He had slipped a knife from his brace and was just about to send it into the side of Dandrican's head, when Brimblade must have caught the movement out of the corner of his eye and began to turn. Brimblade's response was faster than Fraenk was expecting, especially considering all the magic he had expended in the wizard's duel in the upper city. Both men reacted simultaneously, but then a shout from someone else turned everyone's attention. A blood-covered man bound up in Dandrican's ceremonial scaffold that Fraenk had fairly assumed was dead. "Fraenk! It's you!" he shouted, seeming to recognize him. There was something familiar about the other man as well, but he was covered in blood, and Fraenk had absolutely no time to think about how they might be acquainted. Using the split-second diversion, Fraenk flung the knife just as Brimblade called forth his magic. He saw it strike the hell-touched in the shoulder before one of his wicked energy spheres came humming far too close for his own liking. There was a close blast, and Fraenk found his legs pumping with no ground underneath them. He tumbled to a hard stop on the docks a moment later. Fraenk turned to see if Brimblade was conjuring another one of those spells, which he was fairly certain that he wouldn't be able to dodge this time. But when he looked, Fraenk saw an angelic being flying through the air with a small sword raised in hand. She hit Brimblade solidly and immediately began rapidly and furiously stabbing him. Fraenk blinked and realized it was Kyla. He had no time to be impressed, however. The impact tremors from the creature were getting very close, and he didn't have to look to know where the monster was, for it was filling the entire side of his vision. Fraenk scrambled to his feet, drawing 2 blades. He located Dandrican standing in front of the sacrificial scaffold. He had both arms raised, and a vicious blizzard of ice and snow was swirling around him. Even the lake water underneath was freezing solid and forming a column of ice that was raising him up. Fraenk knew he had to stop this. He flung the first blade, aiming right for Dandrican's head. His arm made an anemic flop forward, and the throwing knife clanged harmlessly to the dockboards. Something was wrong with his muscles. Fraenk quickly tried again with his offhand, and the same thing happened. It was like his arms lost their strength whenever he tried to hurt Dandrican. Then he realized that was exactly what was happening. Another cantrip from the mind thief. Dandrican unleashed an anguished scream then, a brilliant glow coming from the necklace. In response, or maybe in conjunction, the creature unleashed an unholy, deafening resound that vibrated the air around them. The twin sounds seemed to pitch and modulate for a maddening amount of time until their notes became one. Then all went silent. Dandrican fell to one knee, gasping for breath. The Leviathan stood motionless and staring with its many terrible eyes. "Fraenk! Fraenk!" he heard the man's grateful cry. "You came to rescue me!" Fraenk looked closer. Then finally recognition dawned. Although he was shirtless and skin slashed in several places, not to mention a wash in his own blood, Fraenk finally knew. "Nym?" Fraenk said, incredulous. It was Nym Stonebridge, the junior preceptor of Blackroot. Fraenk just now realized he hadn't seen Nym in days. Had he been kidnapped and tortured by the Palewood Brethren this whole time? He quickly rushed over to the man and began hacking away the bindings. "I knew you'd come, Fraenk. You must have figured out the Palewood Brethren were up to something, and then when I was kidnapped you spent the last 2 days tracking me down," Nym said, rubbing his sore wrists. "That's exactly what happened." Fraenk agreed. "Glad I found you in time. Can you stand? I need you to go get the partisans and—" Fraenk just realized Bright Rock would not be coming to their aid. "The Arcane Lords, the Council of Wizards, everyone. Wake the city. Bring every man who can hold a spear or fire and arrow." "It's no good, sir," Nym said, clutching Frank's shoulder for stability. "I'll find some way to distract Dandrican. Lead the creature away from the city." Then a noise like a peal of thunder came from the sky. It almost sounded like a chuckle, but a most awful, unearthly bedlam that made one despair of ever knowing joy again. Fraenk saw both Dandrican and the creature were laughing.
"Fraenk, how do you like my new pet?"
Dandrican shouted down from the top of the ice column.
"That fool Fernbrook wanted the power of a king, but he could have had the power of a god."
"You're still a small, pathetic man stealing magic from your betters," Fraenk shouted back. Fraenk saw the massive black appendage, the thickness of a tree trunk, come dropping through the air. He had just enough time to pull Nym out of the way before the monster's tentacles smashed a runnel through the dockboards.
"Careful with that tongue, Fraenk, or I won't let you live long enough to see your beloved city destroyed. Arethes is full of spoiled and entitled elves. Far too long they have decided what is right, when they are as corrupt as any. They're no saviours. They only pretend to be righteous. They're meddlesome, interfering in the Tigrayan kingdom's affairs, propping up the weak tyrant who should have been left to be crushed by the mighty army of Krieg. Only an iron hand like Krieg can save the world."
"Hey, Dandrican!" Fraenk shouted, interrupting him. "I don't care why you're doing this. You just sound insane!" Dandrican's monologue faltered and his expression darkened. At first, Fraenk thought it was a reaction to his insult, but then another man limped up beside him, a very familiar and adversarial individual with dark red skin and long black horns. Fraenk nearly jumped out of his skin. He scrabbled for his knives, but felt a calm, firm hand on his shoulder.
"Wait, Fraenk, he's with us,"
Kyla said. "What? Since when?"
Since I'm no longer slave to this.
Sozon Brimblade tossed the collar down with a heavy clunk.
I've been enthralled to that fetid worm for years. That's how he controlled me.
You expect me to let all that other stuff go? Fraenk narrowed his eyes. You tried to kill me!
I mean, we've all tried to kill you, Fraenk.
Kyla winked at him. You're not helping, Fraenk said back.
If you still have grievances, Neversleep, we can sort it after we survive the Netherdemon,
Brimblade replied. Then they all turned as Dandrican shrieked in rage.
Faithless betrayer! You can all die together!
The blond man shouted, his breath steaming around the necklace. The Leviathan sprang to life, arms, tentacles, and body all thrashing itself at them. They ran back up the docks. Even Nim, who was in the worst shape of any of them, had channeled newfound strength from pure survival instinct. The creature's ponderous appendages crashed down just behind them as they sprinted.
I can open a nether gate to send it across, but I'll need time to pour out a ferrosulfur circle big enough for it to fall into,
Brimblade explained between breaths. Won't that open a door big enough for a bunch of other monsters to pour through? Fraenk shouted.
I never said it was a great plan,
Brimblade fired back.
If you've got a better method to banish an eldritch monstrosity to the void, we can do it your way instead.
Fine. Kyla and I can help you with the circle. Nim, take my horse and get every arcane lord and partisan you can down to the docks. We're going to need them, Fraenk added. They made it up to the boardwalk and paused. The creature had fallen back as its progress was slowed by having to smash its way through the new construction of a more solidly built pier. After Fraenk made sure Nim was safely riding away back into the city, he took one of the fat pouches that Brimblade had on his belt.
We start with a half circle. Once the creature is inside, we close it up and open the portal. Remember to use only half. Pour it thin and make it last,
The hell-touched man instructed.
It has to reach the other's line. If it's not a complete circle, the spell will fall apart.
Fraenk and Kyla exchanged a look as if to ask if they were really doing this, but they didn't have any other options. They moved out until they stood in a wide triangle. Fraenk checked back over his shoulder to gauge if their dimensions would accommodate the Leviathan. Did he seem like a large or an extra large? It was so hard to tell just by eyeball. They started pouring out the contents of the pouch on the ground, hoping the circle's dimensions would be correct, and that they had enough of the strange crystalline powder to go around. Fraenk stepped as quickly as he dared, easing out a thin stream from the bag. Fraenk tried not looking at either his other two associates, or the behemoth that was now getting closer every moment.
Hurry, Fraenk! Get ready!
Kyla shouted. Fraenk looked and saw her side was prepared already. Brimblade stood at the top of the arc and had started muttering out the spell to open the portal. Fraenk felt his bag had about half left. He backpedaled away from the line and watched the monster approach. Wait for the creature to get close, Fraenk said. Don't open it yet.
Thanks, I had no idea how to spring a trap.
Brimblade fired back sarcastically.
Boys, do I have to start stabbing people again?
Kyla cut in. The two men went quiet but shot angry glares at each other. They all moved to the back of the circle, just as Boltzone the Leviathan stepped up out of the water. It was coming straight for them. Fraenk could feel fear and panic rising as its heavy footfalls tremulated the ground underfoot. Without thinking, he whispered a prayer to a power that he hadn't spoken to in many years. Not that he was likely to answer at this point. Their lives were now in the hands of their former foe, and they had no idea if this scheme would even work. They were about to find out. The creature had just taken its first step into the circle when Brimblade gave each of them a nod.
Pour it now, go,
he shouted. Fraenk and Kyla shot forward, separating on either side of the beast. It seemed confused at first, unsure of who to smash first. Fraenk found the end of the ferrosalt line and began to pour from the pouch. At the same time, Brimblade spat out the final part of the spell. He held out his arm, which was already bleeding from where he'd been stabbed by Frank's throwing knife and many more times by Kyla's dagger. The moment his blood hit the ferrosalt, it burst into multicoloured flames. They ignited the powder in a run, moving quickly around where they had poured it and was catching up to where Fraenk and Kyla were attempting to meet in the middle. As the flame leapt up, Fraenk could already see the world shimmering and starting to draw thin under the monster's foot. It was working. All they needed was to connect the circle for the fire to complete the opening. With any luck, the beast would fall through into whatever hell waited on the other side. Almost there. Fraenk grunted, pouring and stepping quickly. Just a few more seconds. Fraenk felt his bag getting light, too light. He wasn't sure if he'd make it to Kyla with his remaining powder. Then an icy dread hit him as the last powder fell from the bag. The flames surged right up to the end of the line.
Fraenk, move!
Kyla shouted from right behind him. Fraenk stepped aside just as Kyla finished her own bag, coming up to meet the end of his. The flames met and the circle was complete. A wave of relief and elation washed over him, and Fraenk felt emotion boil up in his chest. The ground inside the circle began to vibrate and waver madly, and an entirely new hellish landscape began to fade into view. Fraenk was so intent on watching the portal that he didn't see the beast was making a final desperate attack, its tentacles coming down from above with terrible force. If the monster had chosen Fraenk and Kyla as its target, they would have been taken completely unaware. But, unfortunately for the hell-touched man, he was the focus of its fury. There was a moment where Swords and Brimblade was standing, conjuring the portal to a nether realm, and in the next instant, a massive black tentacle was there instead. Kyla saw it too and screamed. An instant later, the portal was gone and the magical fire turned to smoke. "Slossing hells," Fraenk muttered. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.